America spends 20% of GDP on healthcare. So you have twice the chronic disease, spending twice as much, right? And it's obvious that like once people get chronic diseases, it's extremely difficult to fix. But before they get the disease, their blood work is screwed up for a long time. And so that's the area where there's a lot of opportunity, is actually looking at the blood work, empowering people to do it for themselves. And so, slowly, step by step, we got into this kind of mode of thinking. And the last couple of years, that's really scaled up. So now we're doing, tens of thousands of tests and every month, and kind of really starting to play a meaningful role in helping people prevent chronic disease. But that's the story. That's how we got into it originally, is just through the actual blood testing technology.
Well, identifying the need was there is key, right?
Yeah.
And what I love is the education piece, because that's what I do. I will actually preface this podcast just by saying this is not medical advice. Anything that we discuss here is simply for informational purposes only and for educational purposes only. But it's so important for people to understand these metrics. Do you know how many people, Michael, I have talked to, and they have no idea what anything means? Like, we're talking nothing.
Mm.
Like, they don't even know triglycerides. And all they know is, yeah, I was told by my doctor that my cholesterol's bad. So now I need to go on medication. And this is what literally
Yeah.
comes out of people's mouths. And I find it shocking. So I'm certified in functional lab testing for nutritionists. And I did that just so that I can speak to it and explain that there are so many actionable things that you can do to be preventative, you know, and we can play with these numbers before it becomes a disease and something diagnosed. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's look, I mean, my view on it is basically, in the ideal world, you wouldn't have to worry about these things, right? So basically, in some long-term technological future, this would just be taken care of, right? And we do have things like that where it used to be a big problem, and then we just found the technological solution, and nobody cares about it anymore, right? So like, there are no podcasts about people getting a cut and it's getting infected and whatever. You just take antibiotics, you kind of
Yeah.
don't worry about it, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that for a lot of things now. So, if you look at like the major things that really cut like healthy years of life off of people's lives, and even young people, right, is like inflammatory diseases, autoimmune, hormonal issues, right? So, like a very large percentage of men, even my age now, have very low testosterone for unknown reasons. Actually, it's like poorly understood what's going on. So maybe it's circadian, maybe it's something in the environment, like not well understood. But there basically, if you have these types of problems, in the system, and there's no magic bullet solution yet that doesn't include blood work. It's like, if you could just take a pill, it all goes away. That would be amazing. But in
Sure.
the end, it ends up having to be very, very personalized, because for each person, there are different flavors of like what can be changing in your body that's like not working ideally. And just in the modern world, I mean, this is it's funny, like I read this joke somewhere, probably on Twitter. Like, this guy describes all of the stuff he's doing to get better sleep, and it's like a huge list of things he's doing to get better sleep. And he's like, and after doing all of this, he's got the blue light blockers and the whatever, like the cooling pad for his bed and whatever. And I use all this stuff, so it's funny to me. But it's and then he says, and then I finally could get like the sleep quality that my ancestors were getting sleeping on a rock, like worried about getting eaten by cheetahs. And so it's like, probably we're just operating our bodies way outside the normal planned like engineering, but that's the reality. Like, nobody wants to live in the forest, right? So like, if you want to get good sleep, you do have to like figure out how to get your circadian rhythm to actually follow the correct, like, your cortisol should be released in the morning, not in the evening, and all these things. And I think blood work really helps with that. And basically, unless you're really going to not use technology, you're going to like, grow your own food, everything else, you do have to embrace technology and just try to like use it to make your life actually work. And I think that's where blood work can be very powerful, especially if it's convenient, right? So if it's realistic to do it frequently enough, and if the context is there, it's easy to track and understand. And that's how we view it, and we try to make it that way, like as low cost and easy as possible, so you can integrate it into your life. and try to at least optimize around these things that we're like exposing ourselves to all the time as 21st century people.
You said something there that I actually really love is you talked about individuality. And I think that this might be a little bit of a missing piece in how our health is managed by traditional Western medicine, where let's say, for example, myself, I go to the doctor, I have high cholesterol. The standard is I'm given whatever, isn't Lipitor one of the drugs, or,
Mm-hmm.
and I start at the standard dose, and I'm like, but, I personally know there are different things that I could do. And I also know, and I'm not sure what you think about genetics. I also know that I am predisposed to myopathy, which is, the severe cramping and problems with joints if I go on a statin. I know CoQ10 can help that, but how many doctors tell you that? So what I'm saying is that we are all individual, and looking at multiple biomarkers that are health markers can really help us to tweak what we need to do, whether it's just get off our ass and exercise more, move our body more. Maybe that could move the needle. Or whether it's adding a very good quality omega-3, or, whatever it is. I just love that you mentioned bio individual, and we all need to be treated individually, which I think is a missing piece right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's missing. I would say that's missing, not just so in medicine, there are some attempts to do this, and a lot of it is also financial. Like basically, if you're paying $200,000 a year for concierge medicine, you're going to get all of that, right?
Yeah,
So, but
yeah.
it's if your doctor has 7 minutes a year to talk to you, and they have to fill out, they have to do like click something 100 times, just like get you through the whatever insurance pathway. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in America, doctors are increasingly just filling out forms. Like, so I think that's a lot of the difficulty. It's not that they don't understand that each person is different. I think there's just, it's the, for whatever reason the system is like this, it's difficult for them to actually do individualized care. And so they have to kind of like, okay, if we have 1,000 people and we give them all statins at this dose and whatever, like on average, this is going to be okay.
Yeah.
And of course, you want to go towards the best solution for each person. I mean, when you bring your car into the mechanic, even like they actually look at it. They don't just say like, well, the average car in this case takes this much gas or whatever. I mean, they actually see what's going on, right? So you probably get better care for your car than for yourself if you're just doing a yearly checkup, right?
Mhm.
But I think even with like wellness and other like things outside the traditional healthcare system, what happens a lot is people will cite studies. So they'll say like, okay, this study shows that like, this supplement is really good for this, right? But in reality, what the studies are hiding is that people are very heterogeneous. So if you look at the details, half of the people responded and half didn't, or whatever. And so if you're doing blood tests yourself, you can try these things and actually see. I mean, do omega-3s actually lower your inflammation, right? Because it
Yeah.
might be, these are complicated systems, and in each person they're different, depends on their age, their genetics. It's like many things, the external factors, whatever, right? So, but if you're seeing your blood work, and this is also true like about tracking your sleep and things like that. I mean, in the end, like you see the numbers and okay, is this working for me or not? Rather than looking at studies, and then you're basically just playing a numbers game. Like, am I in the 30% of people that benefit from this or whatever? So I think there's, regardless of whether you're looking at like traditional medicine or, more like wellness things like supplements and so on, and even exercise or whatever, I think anytime you can get a feedback loop going that's on an N of one level, like on yourself, that's always the ground truth compared to saying like, okay, on average, this lowered people's inflammation or whatever, which is people are just so heterogeneous that it's difficult to, I mean, that's always not as good as looking at the, on a personal level. It's the same as even if you look at like, I don't know, I have kids and like teaching kids, right? So like if you stick 30 kids in a classroom and you do the same thing for all of them, like 15 of them are going to learn the lesson or whatever. But if you actually sit with a kid alone, like one-on-one, they're going to learn, you can check whether they're actually learning anything and adjust and so on. And eventually they'll get it.
Totally.
So, and so that's kind of, it's the same type of thing. People are just very individual and have totally different processes going on.
100%, 100%. And I was actually just talking to one of my kids about attention span and and I want to ask you about genetics actually. And so, for example, I look at my genetics upside down, any which way, but I also know that, genetics do not mean that, you will get this disease. It just means that you might be predisposed to it. And maybe then that's when you bring in a test. Like if you're like me, I'm a geek, kind of like you. I know you said you're a little bit of a geek. You like to know the data. So I like to know the data. So I will take my genetics, but then I will do regular blood work and see how can I best sort of manipulate, maybe manipulate's not a good word, but how can I best adjust those biomarkers depending on my genetics, also depending on my stage in life, because I'm a menopausal woman. So what works for the Maniverse, I call them the Maniverse, like all of the big names in the wellness space, like Huberman, Peter Attia, whatever.
Hmm.
And for example, they talk about fasting and I'm like, that doesn't work for me right now. It's not going to help me. It's
Hmm.
actually probably going to raise my cortisol. So what I'm saying is like health is really complicated and there's so many factors. So what do you think about genetics and then doing regular biomarker testing?
I'm generally more skeptical about genetics as a way of like it's entertaining, but I'm more skeptical of, unless you really find something rare, I'm skeptical that you can use the genetics to really guide any kind of behavior. Like there are some specific things, like certain supplements work better for certain people with certain
Yes.
like they have to take a little bit more of this supplement or whatever.
Yes.
But on average, typically, like genetics tells you a much more general thing about people like you, whereas your blood work tells you like what's going on in your body now. So I think it's a much more like we don't offer, for example, like some companies will say like, oh, we'll take in your DNA data, or like we'll do a DNA test on you and then give you suggestions for whatever. And so there are a few things you can do with that, but compared to blood work, it's much weaker signal because again, it's population level, like and genetics, your genes never change, right? So it's not like a this is what's happening with you today. Epigenome maybe is more like, because that does change the which genes are turned on and off, but I
Yeah.
think the epigenome is still very poorly understood. So they have like aging clocks, which actually SiPhox is going to offer that to our users very soon. But it's, I think that the aging clocks are fun and it's interesting to see how they correlate with your blood work, how they correlate with how you feel and so on. But it's super early. Like for you to, for example, take like a methylation test and then actually it tells you like, okay, you need, your circadian rhythm is messed up or whatever. That we're not there. So
Yeah.
so basically like that, like biological age, definitely interesting, but it's in terms of like true actionable, like this is, for example, like if you do a cortisol test, a 3-point cortisol test and you get a curve,
Yeah.
and like it's supposed to go up in the morning to wake you up and then it peaks and then starts going down during the day, and at night it's supposed to be low and that allows you to fall asleep. So some people, for example, get a peak at 3 in the morning, and so they just are wide awake, like eyes open at 3 in the morning. I mean, that's happened to me before. Like if you have extremely stressful things going on at work or whatever, you'll just I would wake up at 3 in the morning and just eyes wide open thinking about work, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, that might be healthy for a week or something if you need to get something done, but obviously you cannot survive, you can't thrive living that way. And so if that's happening, you measure your cortisol and you can see that, right? But if you do a genetic test or epigenome or whatever, you can't, it's not that like ground truth level. It's not so close to the action that you can literally see, okay, so what do? I have to somehow lower my cortisol, or I have to figure out how to like get my body better. So, there's all these recommendations, right? Like in terms of when you're exposed to what color light, there's all kinds of hacks to get it back into the right, get that curve into the right shape. But I think to me that feels more serious and less like entertainment, whereas the genetic stuff is a little bit more entertainment. There are certain things in it, of course,
Yeah.
that like are important, but I think you get way more. I'm more of a biomarker, like proteins, hormones believer than I am, and maybe like things like glucose curves over the day and things like that versus things that are closer to the final product, right? Because proteins and hormones are what actually, and metabolites, that's the action in your body, right? Genes are very far upstream, so you're not really seeing the end result as much. That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And those, I do find the biological versus chronological tests very interesting, and I've done them myself. And I hope you guys do get into that, because that's super, super
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah,
And
that'll launch. That's going to be anybody that's a subscriber or member will have access to those tests very soon.
oh,
So we're
amazing.
already testing them out with some of our B2B customers, and so we'll have them out within a month, I would say.
Okay, so I guess we should talk about, we kind of got into what proactive and preventative health is. Let's get into, what does a health biomarker actually mean? And
Hmm.
like, how did you guys, because you guys test 17 plus you have like extra add-ons, correct?
Hmm. Yep, yep, yep.
So let's get into, what are health biomarkers for anybody who's really new to understanding this.
Yeah, I think the best way to talk about this is to actually go. I'll share my screen and just walk through. Do you mind enabling share screen? Because I think it's an interesting way to do it. So when we designed our panel, we tried to. So if you look at, so there are a bunch of companies in the space that'll give you a home test. I would say it splits up into the search engine optimization companies. So for example, like people search cholesterol test. And so there are companies that are like, we will sell you a cholesterol test because you searched for cholesterol test. That's like Everlywell, let's get checked, whatever. Then there are companies that just give you access to, like a Venus draw place, so like LabCorp Direct or whatever. And
Yeah.
they don't have any opinion. They're like, buy whatever you want, right? Just come in, get your 10 tubes of blood and then do what you want with them. And it's expensive also. So those are like the standard options. And then you have companies like Inside Tracker, and now there's like Function Health also from Mark Hyman. But those are typically like, you get a big Venus draw, like a lot of tubes, and then they give you like a bunch of markers. They're like, we have 75 markers, or we have 450 markers, or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of those markers, so the number sounds good, but what they do is they give you the same stuff you get from like a yearly physical, like comprehensive metabolic panel, and it'll be like sodium. So like, I mean, for normal person, your sodium is very tightly controlled. So it's not, they basically put a lot of very low cost, very easy tests in there to get a very high number. So that's not the approach we took. We really refined, like, because we have a limited amount of blood, like you're just getting it from your finger. We
Yes.
really wanted to get the most markers for the lowest cost. And every marker, we look at it as like precious, because you have to put effort in to collect this. You have to, it's not like you're not doing it for fun, you're doing it for the data. And so, well, some people find it fun, but it's but basically, we really put a lot of work into making sure that the markers are useful and actionable, and also markers that you will not get typically from your doctor. So like,
Okay.
we're not going to measure your red blood cell count. I mean, that's something when you come into the doctor every year, they measure that. It doesn't change frequently. So we really focus on things that change and that are normally not measured at all. So for example, I'll just walk through some of the markers. So
Sure.
like in our standard panel, if you look at, so these are the add-ons we sell now. We're about to launch a few more of them, but that's like hormone and thyroid. But I'll talk through the standard ones. So we kind of have four categories. There's cardiovascular, hormonal, inflammation, and metabolic, and that kind of covers a lot of chronic diseases are covered there. Looking at like what are your risks for chronic disease, which direction are you trending? So if you look at hormonal, for example, this hormonal and nutritional, we kind of pair it. But for example, like TSH. So a lot of times you're not going to get your TSH measure unless you have some symptoms. But actually, this is a good leading indicator of like, is your thyroid functioning? Because if your thyroid's functioning poorly and not producing enough hormone, first of all, that screws up your metabolism. But second of all, your brain starts to produce more thyroid stimulating hormone, which is TSH. So if you have a high TSH, it means you're not getting the right level of thyroid hormone out of your thyroid. And so this can be a great early indicator. And we kind of group it here where we actually show whether or not it's included in a typical yearly blood test. And whether, and obviously all of these, well, this is just more marketing, but all of these are recommended by functional medicine doctors. So if you go to like concierge medicine or functional medicine, they're going to test all of these. And you have your cortisol, so you'll see if you take the test in the morning, you'll see your morning cortisol. If you take it in the evening, you'll see your evening cortisol. We also are launching a 3-point cortisol saliva test soon that'll
Oh,
allow you to
good.
get the full curve. And then depending on your sex, you get a couple of hormones. So like women get FSH and estradiol, and then men get DHEAS and testosterone. But then if you want to go like deeper into hormones, we have a whole separate panel for men and women. They're slightly, they overlap a little bit, but they're different. So you get things like free testosterone for men, you get DHEA for women in the expansion pack, folate. So things that AMH, things that are, can be really interesting depending on your situation. And then if your TSH is out of whack, or just if you are interested in, deeper thyroid data, you can get the thyroid expansion. So the way it works is normally inside the test, there's one card. Let me actually show it. So this is you get test kit like this. It comes in a box that holds a couple of test kits. So you have a backup test kit, and then we have some, we give you some tools that like make it easier to collect the blood. So there's a little kit in there. And then if you order a continuous glucose monitor, it comes in that box as well. And so, but usually, I recommend getting a CGM only after you've tested your metabolic markers. And if they're not great, then it makes sense to get a CGM to optimize it. But you get a card like this, and what happens is you put blood on these. I mean, you know this, Sandy, but you put blood
Yeah.
on these squares, and it gets filtered here, and you get your serum over here, and then it's dried. You put it into a packet that dries it, and then there's a mailer that allows you to easily mail it back to our lab. And so in the kits where you have an add-on like thyroid or hormone, there's one more strip, so you get like a third little strip, and you have to fill that up as well. But
That
it's
means
very
more
convenient.
blood, people, more blood.
Yes, that's true. But once you're already, it's like once you're already doing it, it's much easier than like the thing
You're
that you
already
really don't want to
bleeding, right,
do.
Mike? You're bleeding,
Exactly.
so you might as well
Yes.
keep it going.
If you wanted, so with the add-ons, this is like 24 different markers or even more. I mean, it ends up being like 30 if you get both add-ons, I think. If you do this with another company, like if you go to everlywell.com or whatever, you literally have to buy like 7 kits to get all these markers. And each kit, you have to individually prick yourself and fill like, 7 different tubes. So they're just not thinking like about the customer experience at all. They're just thinking, okay, you searched for TSH. Let's say, you were worried about your thyroid. So you search for TSH. They're going to make you collect basically the same amount of blood, but you only get TSH. And so it like we think of it from the perspective of like I'm the user. So I tried all the different tests, like my co-founder tried all the different tests. We constantly use our own tests. So we try to make it as valuable as possible. I think the big ones that I mean, I don't know from your perspective actually, which of these markers are the most interesting. It depends really on like for some people it's more like the heart risk. Some people care more about metabolism. I think a lot of women care about their hormonal balance.
So
It kind of depends on your audience, I would say.
you know what? Honestly, it depends. For me, all of it makes perfect sense
Hmm.
because, first of all, I'm a menopausal woman that lives without a thyroid. So I had thyroid cancer at 41. So
Wow.
for me, it's very important that I understand what's going on with my thyroid, obviously, because it's controlled by medication. What's going on with my hormones? Is my estradiol tanked because I am 54? What's going on with my inflammation? Because as soon as that estradiol goes down, I know my inflammation could potentially go up, including HSCRP. What's going
Hmm.
on with my metabolic fitness? Because a lot of menopausal women become insulin resistant, which also happened to me
Yep. Yep.
because it's a double whammy for me. Because if you have no thyroid, or if you kind of go in and out of hypothyroidism, and this is a lot more prevalent than not, by the way, a lot of people don't realize that that can have a pretty direct effect on your insulin receptors. So for me,
Hmm.
Michael, all of it means so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
And then guess what else happens? If you're a woman who's in menopause, who's maybe a little bit hypo, you could even be subclinical hypothyroid, you could potentially have increased cholesterol. So there you go. Didn't I cover all of it? I covered it all, right? So for
Yeah,
me,
I think.
it's all
Oh, sorry.
important.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's all important. It's so important. And I will say this too, which is super, super interesting for the audience listening. I always had relatively normal glucose, fasting glucose,
Hmm.
that is. But my HbA1c in 2022 jumped to 6.1, which is technically like a
Wow.
pre-diabetic state. And this
Yeah,
was
yeah.
right as I was kind of in the crux of starting to exhibit menopausal symptoms.
Mm,
I nipped it in the
interesting.
bud. I actually did something about it with my lifestyle. I reversed it. Now I fluctuate between a 5.5 up to a 5.7, but I did that myself.
Mm,
There was no medication involved. So, how? Diet. And it wasn't like I'm a nutritionist. So, it's not like I wasn't eating well, it's how I was eating. So, this is
hmm.
why I say to everybody, they'll look, not everybody, some people will look at this test and go, okay, so what? Then I take it to my doctor and he puts me on medication. Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, you might need medication. I'm not anti-medication because I live off of it, but there are also a lot of things that are in your own hands once you have this valuable information.
Well, I think for a lot of these things, medication starts, before you get to the threshold where they're even willing to give you medication, because there's side effects to everything. So correctly, the medical system says, look, we can't treat you until you have X, right?
Yeah.
And until you're there, it's all up to you with lifestyle and diet and supplements and sleep and everything like that. So then you have to really know where you are. I mean, I think for me, probably the two most interesting things. So like lipids become interesting to men as they get older because they start
Yeah.
thinking, okay, am I going to have a heart attack? We've had some actually pretty young men take our test, and there's an interesting review on Trustpilot that's like this guy was running half marathons, very healthy. I think he's about 40, and he took the test. He always had a normal LDL, which is like the classic marker for like lipids. But we also test ApoB, which is kind of like the more advanced marker that predicts risk better. It's the protein, not that carries the lipids, the small lipids, low density lipids. And he turned out to have a high ApoB, so he went to get tested. He got a CAC scan, and he ended up getting two stents because he was basically about to have a heart attack.
Wow.
We don't know how many people like this exist, right? Because they don't always come back to us. Once you have that number, you go see your doctor and see what happens. But I think for a lot of young people, lipids are like a faraway thing. You think like, oh, this is somewhere down the line. And I think that's mostly true, but like for this guy, it wasn't, for example. But for me, it's always been, I think Eastern European people like myself,
I
typically there's
do.
probably periods in Eastern European life where you didn't have a lot of food, and so it's difficult, like living in America, definitely difficult to keep like a good metabolism, especially with the level of carbs. Like my wife she's American, but her family is from Asia, and she can eat like massive amounts of carbs. We've actually looked at this, like put a continuous glucose monitor on her, and she just recovers amazingly from it. She can eat like enormous amounts of carbs, and her ancestors, were eating rice all year round. And I mean, it's like, it makes sense, right? Whereas for me, really, it ends up being difficult if I just eat the standard American diet. I mean, I just get very unhealthy. And so metabolism and it's really, really like the triglyceride HDL ratio, fasting insulin. I mean, that stuff really gets out of whack if I just eat whatever, whatever's kind of around. And so it really has been helpful for me to track that stuff. And occasionally I'll put on a continuous glucose monitor. If I see that things are out of whack, I'll put it on and figure out like, okay, where am I getting these glucose spikes? But usually the blood work will show kind of where things are trending anyway, like
Yeah.
between fasting insulin, trig HDL, and HbA1c. So I usually don't wear a CGM, but occasionally I will for that purpose. And the other one is testosterone. I have a very funny testosterone story, actually. So basically, expecting fathers, this is true not just in humans, but it's true like in apes and stuff like that. Expecting fathers, their testosterone drops. So the woman releases some kind of, it's unknown, right? Like a woman does something to drop the male's testosterone after she gets pregnant. So if you, and it even happens to men who are just roommates, like if you live in the same house as a pregnant woman. And so with my first kid, this was before I was doing blood work or anything. But what I noticed was, I gained weight, which is well known. Like, you gain weight when your wife is pregnant, and
Yes.
my knees started hurting. It's like my joints started hurting my knees for the first time in my life. I mean, I'm a young guy, and I was like, what the hell's, I'm dying. Like, why are my knees in pain? I'm, 30 or whatever. And yeah, it turns out low testosterone will actually like it makes your joints worse, like worse joint
Yeah.
recovery. So I started getting knee pain. And the first time I had my first kid, I just put up with it, right? But the second kid, I was doing blood work, and I started doing the expansion panel, like the Hormone Plus panel. I basically found that, but the first one I did, I found that my prolactin was very high, and so I read a bunch of papers, and basically that's the mechanism. So like when your wife gets pregnant, your prolactin goes up. Nobody knows like the mechanism behind that, but prolactin is up and testosterone goes down as like part of there's like a feedback loop. And so I took a bunch of I'm trying to remember what the supplement is. It's called like P5P, I think. So it's a relatively safe supplement. Like there's no issue with taking it short term. So you take like pretty high doses of that supplement and your prolactin drops. And then my testosterone went up. It's like a clockwork. Like I literally got to see this happening. It was amazing. So anyway, so that's like my experience with it. And it definitely helped. Like I had way fewer symptoms. Like I just had a kid, a month ago. So this pregnancy of my wife, not my pregnancy, was much easier for me than the first one because I basically hacked it. So anyway, that's like
Wow.
for me, those are the ones that I find the most interesting, at least at the stage where I am. But it's definitely I think for each person, if you do a broad blood test, there's always typically there's something that they'll find beneficial.
There's got to be something with the pheromones or something that makes that happen.
Yeah, yeah,
Saying you're not going to have any more babies.
yeah, something like that.
Seriously, but you got to think about it. Like we are animals, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's something innate about it saying you need to stick around. You're not going to go find another mate.
Yes,
Right? So that's
yes.
so
It's
interesting, Michael. Wow, I've
Yeah,
never heard
unfortunately,
that.
testosterone is not just correlated to to that stuff, right? It's also everything else, and it's anyway. But
Of course, it's just like, the same thing with women. Women feel much better when their estrogens are at a healthy, and we get joint pain and that sort of thing at
mm,
menopause when estrogen and estradiol just declines. But also we need the testosterone too. As women, we need it as well, just in much
mm,
smaller ratios than you guys. So that's really interesting. Okay. So let's compare a SiPhox okay, we know that your doctor's not going to necessarily check. That's the issue that I have is that I don't necessarily get the same blood work, if at all, when I go and see my
hmm
general physician. So I like to do a comparison. And so if I'm like going and sometimes I get blood work done, sometimes I don't, sometimes there's missing markers. So the consistency is really nice to have so that you can actually see trends, which is obviously a real benefit. But I also say I can't stand sitting in a lab fasted, like that. And then here where I am, there's lineups and you have to book in advance and it's a real pain. So there's the convenience of going downstairs. I put on my pot of coffee and then I do my blood work and then I'm ready to go. So there's obviously some obvious benefits. But in terms of the accuracy, this is what I'm sure a
hmm
lot of people will ask. You mentioned silicon photonics.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So today, the way this is, we should go through this. Just haven't had a chance to get in. So this is the silicon photonic chip that we're working on. This is like the blood test chip. This
Okay.
is not used for the test that we sell today. So this is a R&D project
Okay.
which we're building in Boston. So we have a 7,000 square foot lab where we're doing that R&D work. And we have a second lab that
Wait, what's
actually processes
R&D?
these cards,
Sorry.
or research and development.
Okay.
So this has not been cleared by the FDA yet. So we're building this. It's actually a working, like we do demos and so on, but it's called an investigational device. So once this is out, you'll actually be able to get results at home, like instant results.
That's
You just put your blood in
amazing.
here, and it plugs into a little box, and so there's a little bit more information. Like if you go on our website and click about us, there's more info on that.
Can I ask another question about it? That
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that what you kind of classify as like home hardware kind of thing? Like you
That's true. That's home hardware, yes. So
Okay.
that'll be actually once it's FDA cleared, you can prick your finger. It's a smaller amount of blood, which is
Oh, I lost you. Where'd you go?
um yeah, so it is a smaller amount of blood. You get the result instantly, and but it's going to be about 4 to 6 markers per cartridge. So it's more for tracking. Like once you have taken a broad test, let's say, and you find out, okay, I really need to track my thyroid. That's what would be. This is what it would be great for. You get a lower cost, more frequent measurement that takes very little blood. So that's in the works. That's kind of like the big mission of the company is to get this home device out. What what we're on the market with now, the test kits where you mail in your blood. This is I would say the best test kit on the market in terms of the number of markers, the amount of blood, the quality of the markers, the price, like everything. So we're market leading in that sense, but actually this still uses FDA cleared standard tools. So when the card comes into the lab, the region that has the serum gets punched out and rehydrated. So it has like a dried little area where your serum has been filtered from the blood cells. And that's part of the magic is that like once you filter the serum and dry it, it can last for 2 weeks in that like desiccant packet. So it gives it time for shipping. It's very stable in shipping. And then there's a process of rehydrating it and making the measurements on the standard FDA cleared tool. So in terms of the accuracy, lots of our users think about this, right? And we have a lot of kind of like nerdy or biohacker types that use our product. So a lot of them will actually go and get a venous draw with their first test and, compare it. And so we've had lots of great, you can look at our reviews, like there are many people who have tried it and have had good results. There are also people that try it and don't get good connection. That's more rare, but often that's like, oh, I tried it. And then a week later, I went to get a venous draw. And it's like, well, even if you do a cortisol test 10 minutes apart, because you got a needle stuck in you, that cortisol is going to change. So you really have to, like the way to do a good comparison is actually to have the phlebotomist ideally to have the phlebotomist take your blood and at the same time have someone else prick your finger, and that's like the best. That's how we do our comparisons. But if it's like 10 minutes apart, it's okay, for most markers. But once you start getting like a day apart, I mean, some people will write us reviews like even like, I took a blood test 3 months ago, I took the SiPhox test and the results are similar enough where I feel confident. But obviously if you really want to do an experiment, you have to do it same day, same time, because many markers change over the day. And like even testosterone will be
Hormones.
high in the morning. Hormones, exactly. So in general, the way these tests are regulated, they're regulated by something called CLIA-CAP. So FDA regulates tests that are like a device, and any test that's mailed to a lab like this, in general, is regulated by something called, it's a federal regulation called CLIA-CAP. So you have to do very similar validations to what people do for the FDA. The difference is that you have a lab director, and they kind of are in charge of making sure that everything is done right. So it's only validated for the one lab where this is run. It's not like with an FDA cleared test, you can just run it anywhere. And so the validations are taking venous blood, taking finger prick, and making comparisons and showing that you have very good correlation. So you're getting the same results from a mailed sample that goes through this whole process as you would just taking blood from the person. So that's all very regulated. I mean, we follow the same regulations as everybody else. I will say that blood testing, if you're in the industry or if you're a doctor that uses a lot of blood work, Sandy, you probably know this. If you're very serious, typically for certain markers, people will always send the blood to the same lab. And the reason is that different labs use different instruments. And the way that the instruments are regulated by the FDA, for some markers, they don't actually agree fully. Because, like for vitamin D is a good example, because there are different forms of vitamin D in the blood. And if you get your blood tested by LabCorp or Quest, they don't fully agree because they use a different manufacturer for their instrument. And those manufacturers, when they get their instruments certified by, like, they submit data to the FDA, they just have to show that they're equivalent to one other FDA cleared instrument. So they use their previous instruments. Like Siemens will show, like, we're just as good as the previous Siemens. and Roche will say we're just as good as the previous Roche, but they might be drifting apart a little bit as they do that. So for certain markers, I think vitamin D is the worst offender, I would say, in our experience. Like you can get, if you send your blood to LabCorp versus another lab, it can be different by like 50% for vitamin D or even more, because
50?
LabCorp always runs low. Yeah, LabCorp always pulls low. So like it's, and this is the crazy thing about, it's like if you're looking at studies and you don't know when they did the study who they sent the blood to, it kind of makes it like very fuzzy, like what's a good vitamin D, right? But in general, for most markers, like ApoB, for example, has amazing correlations across labs, like 99%, everything's good. But for certain hormones, it gets worse. And it's because hormones will have like analogs. Sometimes when you're measuring, vitamin D, there's a couple of versions of it. So you might be measuring a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, and the tests start to drift from each other. But this is the general problem in blood testing. So the best thing to do, if you want to know what's happening to you, you take tests from the same lab over and over, and the lab is going to be consistent with itself. So ideally, if you want to improve, let's say, your vitamin D or improve your testosterone, you're going to look at your last measurement and your current measurement and see where that is. But that's also why you have to be careful with the ranges for things like vitamin D, where like if you don't feel good, maybe it's still worth it to increase it because like you might be getting a measurement on a test that kind of like pulls high or whatever. I think SiPhox in general, this test is kind of middle of the road for most of the markers. So if it doesn't pull high or low for any of the markers. It's kind of middle of the road if you send your tests out to many different labs. That's from our experience. For the ones where there is variability, for other ones, it's like perfectly correlated. And you can see people have put up videos of themselves doing comparisons. So that's my very long answer about this thing, but it's actually quite complicated because biology is complicated. It's not like measuring the voltage of a battery or something. It's actually a pretty complicated. Blood tests are complicated.
They are complicated. And then there's intracellular blood tests as well, like for nutrients, for
Yeah, yeah.
example. You know,
Hmm.
um, I'm sure you've heard of SpectraCell. They kind of do different blood work as well. Like they do,
Yeah, I think that's one reason why we're like skeptical, for example, of doing like a magnesium test, because if you do magnesium blood test, you're missing like there's
yeah,
magnesium inside cells. And so we don't offer a magnesium test, even though like if you go to Insight Tracker, they'll tell you like, oh, your magnesium's fine or whatever, but they're actually doing a blood test,
no
but you
good.
need the cell test. So
Yeah.
yeah, it depends on the details for sure.
Yeah, and just like what you said, hormones are variable. They're always changing. So for women, if you are menstruating, you want to check around day 19, you want to check around the same time in your cycle. And then it's not going to be the same in the morning as it is in the afternoon. And that's like, we tend to synthesize our hormones when we wake up, right? So they're usually at their
Hmm.
peak. So you kind of want to know this information. I don't think a lot of people know that, do they? Like, but then there's certain things like I'm going to say HbA1c has got to be pretty accurate because it's looking at how much glucose is stuck to your blood cell over a 3-month period of time, right? Like, would you agree with that, Michael?
So the way HbA1c works is you have two types of hemoglobin in your blood. Um, which is regular hemoglobin and hemoglobin that has a sugar molecule attached to it. And the amount of your hemoglobin that has sugar attached to it depends on the amount of sugar in your blood. It's kind of like an equilibrium. So because it's a random process, and the more sugar you have in your blood, the more of your hemoglobins will have a sugar. Because it has a 3-month lifetime, like hemoglobin has a 3-month, like if you make a hemoglobin, it takes about 3 months for it to like be basically consumed, and you make a new one in the blood. They talk about HbA1c as having a 3-month, but from my experience, if you measure HbA1c even like every week or every 2 weeks, if you're trending in some direction, you'll see a change. But in theory, it's like a 3-month lifetime just because the protein turns over every 3 months. But obviously, you always have some proteins turning over.
Yeah.
So HbA1c is responsive. I would say like on a 1 week time. Classically in medicine, they say measured, no more than like every 3 months is when it changes. But what they really mean is like every 3 months, your entire store of hemoglobin turns over. So it's kind of like a full new measurement. But if I look at my data, I see trends in my data based on diet and exercise just in the course of like we used to do weekly testing when we were first starting the service. in order to like get a lot of data, and I would see trends on a weekly basis.
Yeah. Well, it's just like, you hear about people who will try and hack their cholesterol tests with their doctor, and they'll, for a few days before, they'll eat nothing with fat, and they
Uh-huh.
will eat, maybe just vegetables basically, like, and they end up
That's funny.
hacking their cholesterol. So, I mean, it's all of it is fluid, but I think you just said it. It's looking at the trends that's important. This is why
Hmm.
when we do blood work more than just once a year, because I'm a big believer in, like, at the absolute bare minimum, if you've got no health concerns at all, you've got to do it at least twice a year, preferably even quarterly.
Hmm.
Quarterly is ideal, right? Would you think?
Yeah, I think so. We think quarterly is the sweet spot. So that's kind of like our most popular thing that people sign up to. The way I see it is like also depends what's going on in your life. So quarterly is good for making some changes and then also just keeping track of what's going on in case there's a large change that you weren't aware of. I think if you're really getting serious, monthly can make sense sometimes. So I've done monthly sometimes when I'm trying to make a change, or even more frequent if you're doing something that's really. But I think quarterly is sustainable. Like very few people are going to do monthly blood work, even with how easy it is with SiPhox. I think few people are going to do monthly for more than a year. We have some customers like that have gone to like 2 years of monthly tests, but I think these are like special people that are like marathoners or whatever. But I think quarterly is sustainable like for your whole life. But occasionally you might want to like increase the volume of tests just if you're making changes. But I think quarterly will show you for most things, will show you kind of where you're going, and it's frequent enough that you can make a change and still remember what you did, 3 months later. Because if you do it once a year, how do you even connect any of these things to each other? And also, you can run into the thing where you have one bad week before the test, and it kind of skews all the markers, right? Let's say you have a very bad week of sleep, then you happen to have your physical, and your markers are kind of out of whack. And what does that really mean, right? And then you have to work around your doctor's schedule. Like, are you going to skip your visit? And these things with SiPhox, you can. I think what's nice is you can wait until you have like a representative. You don't want to over optimize it because then you're kind of fooling yourself. But you wait till you have a representative week where you haven't been sick. You've been sleeping kind of your average, this kind of stuff, and then you take the test. That's
Yeah.
that's how I see it.
Yeah, I love it. Like, you don't want to, I was in Vegas in December. I'm like, well, I'm certainly not going to take the test as soon as I get back from Vegas because my circadian rhythm is going to be off, and, we're
Yes.
out late. It's a 3-hour time change. So, yeah, that's really important to note. Now, let's get into, so I think trends is really important here because I even with weight, so I became a certified metabolic balance coach, and I'm like, please throw away your scale that has the numbers only. We don't care in general about just the number. We want to see the trends of what's going on with your bone, your muscle, your visceral fat, right? So with SiPhox, it's looking at the trends of what's going on with your blood work. So let's look at, or maybe let's talk about what the difference is between regular blood work that you get and why is SiPhox a little bit more optimized? Because that's the big question here in Canada. I know most of my listeners are American, but in Canada, people will be like, oh, I get blood work from my doctor. But it's not the same because you check different things like the ratio of the ApoA1 and ApoA B. Wait, you're going to have to tell me. That's something that we don't even get in Canada. So,
Yeah, I think with so I'm not 100% familiar with the Canadian system, but what we find with our Canadian customers is they'll argue with each other like in the comments section of our Facebook ads. So one of them will say like, "Oh, I get my test for free in Canada," and somebody will reply like, "I've been trying to convince my doctor to give me these tests for 7 years."
yeah.
So honestly, I have no idea what's going on in Canada. Maybe it depends on your doctor. I really don't know, but it's
I think it's Michael.
from
I'm
our
going to
perspective.
say, you know what, though? I think it's because some physicians are okay, they're allowed to test certain things according to Health Canada,
Hmm.
depending on metrics. And I am going to tell the story, and I kind of interrupted you, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
I just have to tell the
that's okay.
story. So my cholesterol went up, and I actually asked for deeper testing, meaning what's oxidized? Can we find out the particle size? Because these are all things I know matter. And I was told that they cannot test that unless I go on a statin. So
Mm,
because I refused the statin, they couldn't test deeper into the blood work than what was standard. So I do believe, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I do believe there's Health Canada constraints there too.
hmm. Yeah, it's not my expertise, but I just know that, we get a lot of interest from Canada, so there must be some reason. But it probably depends where you are also, right? And kind of how your doctor handles it.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. I have to ask you because people ask me, they're like, is this like the Theranos story? Because everybody's seen that
Hmm.
Netflix documentary, right? So I think we kind of
Yeah, yeah,
covered the accuracy and,
yep.
but
That's why I give such a detailed answer about accuracy, because obviously it's a sore subject.
it is a
Um,
sore
Look,
subject.
I think with Theranos, like in the 2010s, there were actually a lot of great blood testing startups, and when Theranos imploded, they kind of killed all these other companies actually. So one of the reasons you don't have a blood test in your home, or a great blood test at the doctor's office or whatever that gets processed right away, is probably actually due to Theranos, because they kind of killed all these other companies. There's a crop of companies trying to do the same thing they were trying to do. What they were trying to do is actually very different from what we're doing. They wanted to do three types of blood tests: so cell counts, chemistry, and immunoassays. We just do immunoassays, but they were trying to do all three from like a enormous tiny drop. Like, a lot of it didn't make sense, because the cells, like if you're doing cell counts, you need a minimum number of cells, which maybe you're not even getting in that tiny drop. So like, it's not a representative. You need enough blood that it's actually like statistically representative, and cells are very big, so you're not getting that many of them in that small drop. So not my expertise, by the way, cell counts, but that's how I understand it. I mean, in the end, now there's like Truvian, Vital Bio, and Genelite are probably the three companies that are really going after that use case where you get all three types of blood tests really fast, and they're going after the doctor's office because those tools are pretty end up being pretty big, and they use tubes of blood. They don't use drops of blood. I think in our case, we're basically, I mean, at least what we sell today, it's actually very similar to what bigger companies like Everly Wellness Get Checked sell. It's just better. So I think it's not a big jump, right? So you're going from, your Everly Well test, which has 4 markers or whatever, and a lot of that is a business decision. Like, they make a business decision where you have to buy 6 kits from them to get 20 markers, whereas we make a business decision to squeeze as much as we can out of that test. So I think in many ways, it's kind of the industry is past Theranos and on to better things. I would say in the last yeah, like about 5 years, it's really matured to where there are people rebuilding the Theranos idea in a more realistic way. There are people doing these at-home tests, like your Let's Get Checked Everly Wells and so on. I think it's pretty, but yeah, will anybody ever get it out of like that? The thing, her holding the tiny little drop, and we're going to do all of your markers out of that. I think that's there are it might get close to that at some point, but it's never going to be quite what was promised probably. But you know i I can make one interesting note on this. Just, I mean, this is more interesting if you follow technology and stuff like that, but basically in every deep tech area, so like self-driving cars, blood testing, whatever, where there's like a very technological component, everybody knows what people want. Like, if you ask doctors, like, what do you want? They're like, oh, I want an instant blood test that does all the markers, right? That I normally measure and have to wait, 2 days or whatever. So it's easy with self-driving cars. Like, you want a car that drives exactly like a person, right? Or better. So it's very easy. It's not like in certain things it's hard to know what people want, but like in things that have technological bottlenecks, you know what people want. It's just nobody knows how to do it. And I think there's always a gap for a company where they're willing to just say that they're doing it, right? Like, you can either try to do it, but then there are all these issues, and maybe it's like not as sexy as people want, and it has some problems and whatever. Or you can just say, like, we're doing it, it's all working. And so you can do that for like typically the lifetime is about 5 years. They kind of had their like 5 years of like saying that they're doing it, but eventually, of course, it blows up. So I think that's kind of how I see it. And it happens in other industries. The reason Theranos is so famous, and there's documentaries and so on, is that they actually started testing people and giving them inaccurate results and doing all kinds of like wacky stuff. And I think if you look at other companies like self-driving car, whatever, frequently they'll make all these claims, they raise lots of money. It's like they're in TechCrunch, news articles, whatever. And then kind of like everybody forgets about it in 5 years and that's it. Because I mean, they just never release anything. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
honestly that's the unique thing about Theranos. It's not that they were BSing their technology. That happens all the time. It's just part of life. There's going to be 10 companies. One of them is going to do this. But it's part of being in like the technology space. You always have the like companies that just say they're doing it.
Yeah.
It happens in parallel to people really doing the work. So anyway, that's kind of my view on it. I think it's good. It gets people interested in blood testing. I think at least like
Sure.
what's the chances of a blood testing documentary happening otherwise, right?
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
I think from that perspective, it's not such a bad thing.
So right now you're only in North America.
Yeah, US and Canada right now. Yeah.
Do you have plans of expansion?
Yeah, we get asked a lot about EU, Australia. So we're looking at it and trying to figure out what all the like, there's a lot of regulation in the EU and Australia, so we're trying to figure out how that would fit.
And then competitors. So you mentioned Let's Get Checked. You mentioned Everlywell. I guess those would be competitors in the US. But what about Canada? Do you even have any competitors?
I'm not that familiar with Canada. I mean, some of these companies sell to Canada also, but I'm not that familiar with the Canadian market. I think the Venus Draw companies like Inside Tracker, I'm pretty sure don't sell to Canada, but I could be wrong. But I see like in terms of competitors, I see the Everly Wells is like one type of their competitor in form factors. You're getting it at home. Inside
Yeah.
Tracker is more of a competitor in like the real value proposition. But then the form factor is much worse. The cost is much worse. So it's kind of, um, we compete with both of those, but in different ways. It's kind of, we optimize the two things together, right? The right markers and the right quantity of markers with the right form factor.
So if somebody new was to start with SiPhox and they are not, let's say, blood work literate, meaning they have no
Hmm.
clue what anything means. I noticed that your website is quite educational on a very high level.
Hmm.
Like it'll give you, but is there an option? Because I know Inside Tracker does nutritional counseling just to help move some of the markers through lifestyle nutrition. Do you
Hmm.
guys do anything like that?
Yeah, so we have a couple of categories of things we do like that. So every test gets insights. So we have a large bank of insights that are based on your blood work, and then they're partially AI generated. Like so, we have an algorithm that looks through your blood work and suggests insights, and then we have a human expert that'll actually go through and select which ones make sense and put them in. So every test you get, there are some insights. I think that one thing that we do differently is we limit the number so that, I mean, you're not going to apply more than one or two things, per test. Realistically, you can't apply like, let's eat these 300 foods or whatever, right? Like I think that some companies do that, and I think it doesn't work. So we
No.
give like what are the top couple of things you can do, and those can be actually like, okay, you have really high HbA1c, you should use a continuous glucose monitor and figure out why, right? Like let's see when is your glucose spiking. So that could be, it might not be nutrition, it might be like a tool, or another test. We might say you might want to take another test that gives you more information. And we do give some nutritional advice, like these types of foods will affect, but we kind of also try not to overdo it. Like we only want to do things that we're good at, so we're only adding these types of things slowly. We have a beta program where we have coaching. It's a little bit hard to find, but once you take a test, there's a little link at the bottom. And so we've done a couple hundred of these coaching sessions so far, and we're getting pretty good results, but that's like early. I think you can take the result if you're really serious. You can take the results to a coach or a nutritionist or whatever. It depends. Kind of, some people like to do their own research. We obviously provide lots of reading materials. Everybody's journey is different. I think different people approach these things differently. You can take it to your doctor depending on how receptive they are. But we try to provide as much context as possible and as many tools as possible. we're always expanding this. Like we're working on supplements. I mean, it's another thing you want to do carefully, right? Because there's just a lot of unproven stuff, or like, quality and everything. So we want to slowly add things that are useful that we think will improve your blood work, not just like selling stuff, because we really want to be like people's partner, like health partner over their course of their life, right? So we wanted them to see that the things we're recommending are actually helping them. So we do a bit, I think we'll be doing more and more over time. But I think even now it's quite a bit more than you would ever get, let's say, from, a typical doctor's visit or anything like that. We give way more information, way more insights and things like that. And then you can always supplement it with different things.
Okay. And just,
People have actually had a lot of luck. This is funny, but people have had a lot. If you have a subscription to ChatGPT, people have had a lot of luck pasting their whole results into ChatGPT and
wow.
getting like suggestions for what to do. There's people have like written articles about this with their SiPhox results, and I think that works okay actually. So ChatGPT will do like an interesting analysis. We're not quite ready to integrate that type of stuff yet. It doesn't always work and so on, but it's an interesting. It's a good game to play. Like it at least gives like another perspective.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it could give a different perspective, but yeah, I have my reservations about Chat GPT, to be honest. You know how many people
Well,
are
if you ask it
saying,
what's like a healthy CRP level, the thing is with ChatGPT, it's trained on like very classic medical stuff. So if
yeah,
you ask it like what's a healthy inflammation level, it's going to tell you like, oh, below 3, but like in reality, that's just because Americans are super unhealthy, and that's the range that's like the CDC says. But like
yeah,
if you really want to be healthy, all the studies show you want to be below 1, and so it's from that perspective, it's not ready for prime time. That's why we don't. But sometimes actually people get really interesting information out of it. So it's a good, like, I would say it's a good curiosity at this point. But it can get a lot better over time, and that might be part of the strategy in the long run. But for now, human is always better, I would say, for this kind of thing.
all right. Well, we have passed an hour. We could probably talk even in greater detail about all the little metrics, but I would love for you to let me know, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to clarify?
Yeah, I think one thing I would mention is that, our service, people don't always use this. I would say only half of people use this, but we connect to all the classic wearable devices like Oura Ring, Whoop, 8 Sleep, whatever, things that track your sleep and activity. And I find that in heart rate variability, I find that getting that into the dashboard can be really helpful. So if you're considering doing these blood tests, I would make sure I'm wearing my wearable for a week or two beforehand, so that that data is in there when you take your blood test, and then you can see, okay, how did I sleep for the 2 weeks before the blood test? Because we'll take that data and kind of average it out and give you a single point, like this is the quality of your sleep prior to the blood test.
Mm.
And this is how much activity you had, and that information I think over time becomes valuable because you can really see the correlations, and we see that in our population, like all the tests that we do. So that's probably the one thing that we didn't mention. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's great talking to you, and outside of the world of like people who are into this stuff, I think it's super early. People don't really understand how important these things are. So it's great that you're doing this kind of education. And I think it's gonna, 5, 10 years from now, my guess is this will be a very mainstream kind of conversation. But right now, I think it's still early, which is fun. But,
Yeah, it is kind of funny that you say that because there are definitely some people who are like, Sandy, some of the stuff that you talk about is really out there. I'm like, this is so normal and mainstream for me. And it's like, maybe what it takes is to be unwell. And then you're like, and then you want to work yourself up to being well. And then you never want to go back there if you can help it. So,
hmm
that's my story. It's like a rags to riches story. I feel better at 54 than I did at 41. And I want
hmm
to be here, not just to be here for a long time, but a good time. I want to be healthy, right? So that's the key for me. So let us know, where can we find you, Michael? Where can we find the kit and the information?
Yeah, I guess you're going to put a link or
I
something below
will.
this, and of course, people can search SiPhox, and there should be a already from the probably from the previous podcast that we did with you. There should be like a discount code that they can use Sandy. I don't know it,
I
but
think
I'm
it's Sandy
sure it has
K.
Sandy
I
in it.
think it's Sandy K.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay. But anyway, I'm sure you'll put it up below this, but basically, we're excited to reach more of your listeners, and I think it's the type of people that really would benefit from what we sell. So,
yeah.
and you can read more about the company, and probably, if this hour and a half of me ranting about blood tests not enough, there's lots of other podcasts that you can find, but it's I think we covered a lot of ground here. So
We did. We did.
this
Thank
is
you
this is a good
so much.
starting point. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. We had a great chat.
Yeah. 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 Thanks. And it's great. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Yeah. Okay. Let me hit.